You think you know what silence sounds like? Real silence? It ain't peace. It ain't calm. Real silence is when the forest holds its breath. It's when the crickets stop, the owls go mute, and even the wind seems to die down because something walked into the woods that makes the mountain lions shake in their dens. I lived in that silence for 3 days. Most folks, they talk about these things, these Sasquatch, like they're monsters, like they're just big apes stumbling through the brush. They're wrong. Dead wrong. Monsters don't have laws, animals don't have religion. What dragged me up that ridge, kicking and screaming into the dark, wasn't a beast, it was a guardian. And what I saw in that clearing, the chanting, the fire, the sheer vibration of it, it wasn't meant for human eyes. I looked into the face of something ancient, and I realized we are guests on this land, unwanted guests. My name is Elias Thorne. For 42 years I worked as a timber cruiser and a surveyor deep in the Olympic Peninsula. I'm not a man who scares easy. I've stared down grizzlies over a fresh kill. I've weathered storms that snapped Douglas firs like toothpicks. I know the woods. I know the smell of pine resin and wet decay better than I know the smell of my own house. But nothing prepared me for November 14th, 1983. I've kept my mouth shut for decades. You say a word about Bigfoot in my line of work and you lose your contract. You lose your reputation. People look at you like you've been drinking too much moonshine or eating the wrong mushrooms. So, I buried it. I pushed it down deep. But you can't bury the truth forever. Especially not when the truth is 8 feet tall and looked at you with eyes that held more sorrow than any man I've ever met. I'm telling you this now as a confession. Not to save my soul, I reckon it's too late for that. But to warn you. There are boundaries in this world, lines drawn in the mud and the blood, and God help the man who crosses them like I did. It started as a day just like any other, or so I told myself. I was working a section of the Hoh rainforest we called Devil's Staircase. It's a steep, nasty patch of old-growth timber, thick with moss and ferns that grow waist-high. The map said it was government land, meant to be tagged for a potential selective cut, but the woods felt like they disagreed. The air that morning was thick, heavy with moisture. It wasn't raining, not exactly, but the mist was so dense it soaked right through your wool coat. I was about 4 miles in, way past where the logging roads turned to mud and then to nothing. I remember the sound of my hatchet striking the bark of a western hemlock. Thwack, thwack. It echoed too loud. Usually the forest absorbs sound, swallows it up. But that day every chop rang out like a gunshot in a library. It felt disrespectful. Around noon, the silence hit. I mentioned it before, but you have to understand the suddenness of it. 1 second, there were squirrels chattering, the distant call of a raven, and then 0. It was like someone flipped a switch on the world. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, prickling like electricity. I froze, hand on my hatchet, breath held tight in my chest. I scanned the tree line. Nothing but gray trunks and green gloom. But I knew. I knew with that lizard part of my brain, the part we forgot how to use when we started building cities, that I was being hunted. I decided to pack it in. To hell with the quota. I turned to head back up the ridge, moving fast, too fast. My boot caught on a slick root hidden under a patch of sorrel. I went down hard. I heard the crack before I felt the pain. My right leg twisted at an angle that legs aren't supposed to twist. I tumbled about 30 feet down the embankment, crashing through Devil's Club and thorns, finally slamming into a rot log at the bottom of a ravine. The pain was blinding. White-hot needles shooting up my thigh. I screamed. I couldn't help it. I screamed for help, knowing damn well no one was within 10 miles to hear me. I lay there for maybe 20 minutes, gasping, trying to keep from passing out. The smell hit me before I saw him. God, that smell. It wasn't just dirty. It was biological warfare. Imagine a wet dog, a skunk, and a pile of rotting garbage left in the sun, all mixed with the metallic tang of copper. It made my eyes water. It made my stomach heave. I heard a twig snap. Heavy. Deliberate. I managed to roll onto my back, clutching my hatchet with a trembling hand. "Get back!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "I've got a gun!" I lied. I didn't have a gun. Just a hatchet and a broken leg. From behind a massive cedar, he stepped out. He was immense. That's the only word. My brain tried to process it as a bear standing on hind legs, but the proportions were all wrong. The shoulders were impossibly wide, easily 4 feet across, tapering down to a waist that looked like solid oak. He was covered in dark matted hair, not fur like a dog, but hair thick and greasy. He stood at least 8 feet tall, but it was the face that froze my blood. It wasn't an animal. It had a flat nose, wide nostrils flaring with every breath, and skin the color of charcoal. The brow ridge was heavy, shading eyes that were dark, intelligent, and absolutely terrifying. He didn't roar. He didn't charge. He just looked at me. He looked at my broken leg. He looked at the hatchet in my hand like it was a child's toy. I tried to swing the hatchet as he stepped closer, but he moved with a speed that shouldn't be possible for something that size. One hand, a hand the size of a catcher's mitt with thick black fingernails, swatted the weapon away. It flew 10 feet and embedded itself in a tree. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the teeth, waiting for the end. Instead, I felt a grip on my ankle. Not the broken one, the good one. His hand wrapped all the way around my boot and calf. The strength was absolute. It felt like being caught in hydraulic machinery. He grunted, a deep, chest-rattling sound, and then he started to pull. He didn't lift me over his shoulder. He dragged me. He turned and began walking deeper into the ravine, hauling me behind him like a rag doll. Every root, every rock I scraped over sent shockwaves of agony through my shattered leg. I screamed until my throat was raw. I clawed at the mud, grabbing handfuls of dirt and pine needles, trying to anchor myself, but he didn't even slow down. He marched with a rhythmic, heavy gait, dragging me away from the world of men, deeper into the dark, tangled heart of the forest where no map had ever been drawn. I passed out from the pain somewhere along the creek bed. The last thing I remember was the canopy above spinning, and that overpowering smell filling my lungs, claiming me. Waking up wasn't like in the movies. There was no sudden gasp. It was a slow, agonizing crawl out of a black pit. The first thing I knew was the heat. It wasn't the cold damp of the forest floor anymore. It was a dry, radiating warmth on my face. I cracked my eyes open. Everything was hazy, swimming in a dim orange light. I was lying on something soft. Furs, smelling of musk and pine smoke. I tried to sit up, and the world tilted violently. A grunt of pain escaped my lips. My leg was throbbing with a dull, heavy rhythm like a second heart beating inside my shin. I looked down. My leg wasn't just broken anymore. It was bound. Rough strips of bark and stiff rawhide were wrapped tightly around my calf, bracing the bone. Packed underneath the binding was a poultice of chewed leaves and mud. It smelled sharp, like menthol and rot. I stared at it, my brain misfiring. Bears don't set bones. Cougars don't apply medicine. I looked up and the breath hitched in my throat. I was in a cavern, not a deep cave, but a massive rock overhang, enclosed by woven walls of thick branches and saplings. Structure, architecture. The fire crackling in the center wasn't a wildfire. It was a built fire contained within a ring of river stones. And I wasn't alone. The one who dragged me, the Alpha I called him in my head, was sitting near the entrance, his massive silhouette blocking the moonlight. He was stripping the bark off a log with his teeth. But there were others. To my left, huddled near the fire, were 2 smaller ones. Females, maybe. They were grooming each other, picking through the fur with gentle, dexterous fingers. Their sounds weren't barks or growls. They were murmuring, a low, guttural chatter that rose and fell like a strange, distorted language. Ooh, woo, ka. It sounded like stones grinding together underwater. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had been dragged into a living room, a home. I shifted my weight, the dry leaves beneath me rustling loud enough to cut through their conversation. Instantly, the murmuring stopped. 3 heads turned, 6 eyes, reflecting the firelight like amber glass, locked onto me. The Alpha stopped chewing. He stood up. God, he was even bigger in the enclosed space, his head scraping the rock ceiling, and walked toward me. The ground vibrated with his steps. I pressed my back against the cold stone wall, trembling. I wanted to beg, to scream, but my voice was gone. He crouched down in front of me. The heat radiating off his body was immense. He smelled of wood smoke now, masking the earlier stench. He reached out a hand and I flinched, covering my face. He didn't hit me. He took a clay-like bowl from the floor, scooped up some water, and held it to my lips. The cognitive dissonance nearly broke my mind right there. This monster, this nightmare that could rip a man in half like a wet paper towel, was nursing me. I drank. I had no choice. The water was cold and tasted of minerals. When I finished, he grunted, a low rumble that vibrated in my chest, and looked deep into my eyes. There was no aggression there. It was curiosity. And something else. Expectation. That's when I realized the horrifying truth. I wasn't dinner. I wasn't a prisoner of war. I was a pet. Or maybe a specimen. He turned back to the others and made a sweeping gesture with his arm. The two smaller ones stood up. They weren't looking at me with hunger. They were looking at me with reverence. They began to sway, a subtle rocking motion, humming that low, vibrating tone again. I lay back down, the realization settling over me heavier than the stone roof above. I couldn't run. I couldn't fight. My only choice, my only hope of ever seeing the sun again, was to survive whatever they had planned, to watch, to learn, and to pray that whatever reason they had for saving me wasn't worse than being eaten. I still wake up sweating, smelling that wood smoke and musk. It's a memory that stays in your bones. Look, I'm sharing this because the world needs to know we aren't the only intelligent things in those woods. If you're brave enough to hear what happens next, what the ceremony actually was, do me a favor. Hit that like button. It helps get this warning out to more people who might be hiking alone in the dark. And let me know in the comments, have you ever felt like you were being watched in the woods? Because trust me, you probably were. Time creates its own rules in the dark. I lost track of it. Was it Tuesday? Friday? Had it been a week since I swung that hatchet? The cave had no clock, only the shifting angle of the light beam that cut through the smoke hole in the ceiling, and the rhythmic, guttural breathing of my captors. The days blurred into a fever dream. The shock of the capture wore off, replaced by the searing, throbbing reality of my leg. The adrenaline was gone, and the infection was trying to set in. My body was fighting a war on two fronts, the trauma of the bone break and the alien bacteria of that cave. I spent long stretches drifting in and out of consciousness, sweating through my clothes until they were stiff with salt. In those fever moments, the tribe didn't look like monsters. They looked like shadows, giants made of smoke and charcoal. I'd wake up shivering, teeth clattering so hard I thought they'd crack, and I'd find one of the females, the smaller one with a patch of silver fur on her shoulder, curled up next to me, not touching me, but close enough to share body heat. It was confusing, terrifyingly intimate. She would watch me with those amber eyes blinking slowly, like a cat watching a mouse it hasn't decided to kill yet. But the challenge came on what I reckon was the fourth day. The atmosphere in the cave changed before I heard anything. The alpha, who usually spent his morning sorting through piles of roots or sharpening stones near the entrance, suddenly went rigid. He stood up, his massive frame blocking out the daylight, his head cocked to the side. His ears, which were usually hidden against his skull, seemed to twitch. Then the others stopped. The grooming, the low humming, the chewing. Everything ceased. The silence was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating. Then I felt it. A vibration in the floor. Thud, 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 thud. Faint at first, but growing. My heart leaped into my throat. I knew that sound. It was the distinct, chopping rhythm of a Bell 206 Jet Ranger, a search and rescue chopper. They were looking for me. Hope, hot and desperate, flooded my chest. I tried to scramble up, forgetting my leg, forgetting where I was. "Here," I croaked. My voice was a dry rasp. I sucked in a breath to scream, to yell, to make any noise that would echo out of that cave. "I'm in he—" I never finished the word. The alpha moved across the cave with a speed that defied physics. He didn't run. He flowed. Before I could get the second lungful of air, a hand the size of a shovel clamped over my entire face. It wasn't a strike. It was a seal. His palm covered my mouth and nose, his thumb pressing into my cheekbone, his fingers wrapping around the back of my skull. He pinned me to the furs, pressing my head into the dirt. The weight of him was crushing. He leaned over me, his face inches from mine. I stared up into his eyes. There was no anger there. There was fear, and there was a command. Silence. The helicopter got louder. It was close, maybe directly overhead. The sound was deafening now, rattling the loose stones on the cave floor, shaking dust from the ceiling. The downwash must have been whipping the treetops just outside. I struggled. I clawed at his wrist, my fingernails digging into the thick leather-like skin beneath his fur. It was like scratching a tire. He didn't flinch. He just held me there, suffocating me, watching the entrance with his other eye. The rest of the tribe had flattened themselves against the back wall, merging with the shadows so perfectly that if I hadn't known they were there, I wouldn't have seen them. For 2 minutes, 2 eternities, the machine hovered. I could imagine the spotter leaning out, scanning the ravine with binoculars. "Look down," I prayed. "See the path? See the drag marks? But the canopy is thick in the hoe. It's a blanket." The sound of the rotors changed pitch. It angled away. The thud-thud-thud faded, drifting east back toward civilization, back toward coffee and hospitals and sanity. As the sound died, the Alpha slowly released his grip. I gasped, sucking in air that smelled of his palm, earth, pine pitch, and raw game. I coughed, tears streaming down my face. I had been that close. He sat back on his haunches and looked at me. He let out a long, huffing breath through his nose. Then he did something that chilled me to the bone. He reached out and gently wiped the tears from my cheek with the back of a knuckle. It was a gesture of comfort. It terrified me more than the violence. It meant he wasn't just keeping me. He was claiming me. I wasn't a lost hiker anymore. I was theirs. From that moment on, the dynamic shifted. The nursing phase ended. The preparation phase began. They stopped feeding me the roots and the cooked fish. Instead, the females brought me a paste. It was dark, purple-black, carried in a hollowed-out gourd. It smelled sweet, cloyingly sweet, like overripe berries in fermentation. I refused it at first. I clamped my jaw shut. The Alpha didn't force me. He just sat there, staring, waiting. His patience was infinite. Hunger is a cruel master and thirst is worse. Eventually I took a sip. It tasted like blackberries, honey, and something bitter, like alkaloid. Within minutes, the pain in my leg vanished. Not faded, vanished. A numbness spread from my stomach to my extremities. My fingers felt light. The cave walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with my own pulse. I realized then they were drugging me. They weren't healing me for the sake of kindness. They were preserving me. They were sedating the livestock before the slaughter. The challenge wasn't about escaping anymore. It was about holding on to my mind. The paste made me pliable. It made the fear distant. I found myself watching the fire and seeing shapes dancing in the flames. I found myself humming along with their strange atonal songs. I was losing Elias Thorne. I was becoming part of the furniture of the cave. And as the days went on, I noticed they were preparing themselves too. They started bringing in clay, white and red clay from the riverbanks. They spent hours painting symbols on each other's chests and faces, spirals, jagged lines. And then, on the 7th day, the Alpha turned to me with the clay bowl. He dipped his fingers in the wet, red earth. He crawled toward me, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows that looked like demons on the walls. He wasn't going to eat me. It was worse. He was going to initiate me. The red clay was cold. That's the detail that sticks in my mind when I try to pull this memory out of the fog. It felt like ice against my fever-hot skin. The Alpha didn't paint me haphazardly. This wasn't some savage splashing of mud. It was calligraphy. He dipped his thick, calloused finger into the bowl and drew a line from the center of my forehead, down the bridge of my nose, over my lips, and down my chin. Then he drew circles on my chest, 3 of them, concentric rings right over my heart. With every touch, I felt less like Elias Thorne. I felt the connection to my life, my truck parked at the trailhead, my mortgage, the taste of coffee, the face of my ex-wife, slipping away. The paste I had swallowed was doing its work. It severed the anchor rope. I was drifting. When he finished, he didn't grunt. He let out a soft, whistling exhale, almost like a bird call. The others in the cave responded. The females, the younger males. There were 5 of them in total now. stood up in unison. They had painted themselves too, white spirals on their dark fur looking like skeletal ribs in the firelight. Then, the alpha picked me up. This time, it wasn't the brutal dragging of the first day. He scooped me up in his arms, cradling me against his massive chest like I was a child, or an idol. I remember resting my head against his fur. It was coarse, wire-stiff, but beneath it, I could hear his heart. It beat slowly. Thump, 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 a rhythm that felt older than the mountains itself. We left the cave. Stepping out into the night should have been cold, but the pace made my blood feel like warm syrup. The moon was full, hanging low and heavy over the Olympics. But through my drugged eyes, the forest wasn't dark. It was glowing. The moss on the trees seemed to pulse with a faint, bioluminescent green. The ferns looked like silver lace. We moved in a procession. The alpha led, carrying me. The others followed in a single file, silent as smoke. You have to understand the terrain out there. The Hoh rainforest is a tangle of windfall ravines and underbrush so thick a man with a machete can barely move a mile a day. These creatures, they ghosted through it. They didn't break twigs, they didn't disturb the ferns. They moved with a fluid grace that shouldn't belong to anything that weighs 800 pounds. It was like watching a school of fish navigate a coral reef, perfect synchronization. I looked up at the canopy passing above me. The stars were streaking, leaving trails of light in my vision. I started to hallucinate. I thought I saw faces in the tree trunks. Old wooden faces watching us pass, nodding in approval. I thought I heard the wind whispering my name. Elias. Elias. Witness. I tried to speak, to ask where we were going, but my tongue was numb. All that came out was a low moan. The alpha adjusted his grip, pulling me tighter. He looked down at me, and for a second the moonlight caught his eyes. They weren't animal eyes. They were filled with a profound, heavy solemnity. He knew what was coming. He knew what he was taking me to see. And I think, in his own way, he was trying to reassure me. We walked for hours, or maybe minutes. Time had dissolved. We climbed higher, leaving the dense valley floor and moving up into the rocky crags where the timber gets sparse and the wind howls. The air grew thinner, sharper. Then the trees stopped. We entered a clearing I had never seen on any map, and I knew the maps. I knew every survey line in this county. This place, it didn't exist in the world of men. It was a natural amphitheater, a bowl carved out of the mountain's granite shoulder. In the center stood a formation of stones, not natural boulders, standing stones, rough-hewn, covered in ancient orange lichen arranged in a perfect circle. And in the middle of the stones there was a fissure in the ground, a crack in the earth that emitted a faint vaporous steam. The alpha stopped at the edge of the circle. He lowered me gently onto a flat rock that felt like it had been polished smooth by centuries of use. The stone was warm, heated from below. The tribe formed a semicircle around me. They weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at the fissure. The silence returned, but this time it was electric. The air pressure dropped. My ears popped. The hair on my arms stood up, not from fear, but from static charge. The atmosphere was charged with so much energy I could taste ozone on my tongue. I realized then that I wasn't the guest of honor. I wasn't the meal. I was the audience. I was brought here to record something, to be the memory for a species that doesn't write history books. The alpha stepped forward alone toward the steaming crack in the earth. He raised his arms that spanned 7 feet, toward the moon. He threw his head back and opened his mouth, but he didn't roar. He began to sing. I said he sang, but that's too human a word for it. The sound that came out of the alpha's chest wasn't music. It was a tectonic shift. It started so low that I didn't hear it with my ears. I felt it in my teeth. My molars started to ache. The marrow in my broken leg began to vibrate like a tuning fork. It was infrasound, the kind of bass frequency that tigers use to paralyze prey, but amplified by a lung capacity the size of a beer keg. The air in the amphitheater rippled. I swear to you I saw the space between the stones distort like heat haze on asphalt. Then, the others joined in. They didn't harmonize in any Western sense. They layered. The females added a high, keen wailing, a sound like wind stripping wire fences. The younger males added a rhythmic, guttural barking. Hoo-ha! Hoo-ha! The cacophony hit me physically. It pressed against my eardrums until I felt a warm wetness trickle down my neck. Blood. The pressure was bursting the capillaries in my nose, but I couldn't look away. I couldn't cover my ears. The paste I'd eaten had locked my muscles. I was a statue, a flesh and blood recording device pinned to that rock. And then the miracle happened. Or maybe the curse. The steam rising from the fissure in the center of the circle. It stopped drifting with the wind. It stiffened. The white vapor began to swirl, organizing itself against the laws of physics. It spun faster and faster, responding to the rhythm of their voices. The Alpha raised his hands higher, his voice climbing an octave to a roar that shook the pine needles off the trees at the edge of the clearing. The vapor ignited. It didn't catch fire, it just became light. A column of pale violet luminescence shot up from the crack in the earth, piercing the night sky. It wasn't a beam like a spotlight. It was textured. It looked like liquid plasma. And inside that light I saw them. I saw shapes, silhouettes swimming in the violet stream. They weren't Bigfoot. They looked like ancestors. Not just theirs, ours. I saw shadows of things that walked on 2 legs, things that walked on 4, things that had been dead for 10,000 years. The connection slammed into my brain. The bond wasn't between me and the Alpha. It was between them and the earth. They weren't praying to a god in the sky. They were singing to the memory of the planet. They were the keepers, the librarians of a history we paved over with concrete and asphalt. I looked at the Alpha's face. Tears were streaming down his dark, leathery cheeks into his fur. He was in ecstasy. He was in mourning. For a moment, just one terrifying, beautiful moment, the drug erased the barrier between species. I understood the chant. I didn't know the words, but I felt the meaning. We remember. We remain. We guard the blood. My human mind couldn't handle the bandwidth. It was too much data, too much emotion. I felt a synapse snap in my head, a sharp pop behind my eyes. The violet light expanded, swallowing the stones, swallowing the tribe, swallowing me. I didn't pass out this time, I ascended. I floated into a space where there was no pain in my leg, no fear, only that overwhelming, deafening song of the earth. I was part of the tribe. I was part of the forest. I was nothing. Script pause. CTA de suspense. Mid-roll 2. Narrator pauses, rubs his temples as if possessed by a migraine. My nose bleeds every time I think about that light. Doctors say it's high blood pressure. I know it's the pressure of what I saw. Look, we're approaching the end. The part where the FBI gets involved. The part they scrubbed from the records. If you want to see the conclusion of this, if you want to know what they did when they found us, make sure you're subscribed. Turn on the bell, because once I finish this story, I'm never telling it again. The song was at its peak. The violet column was pulsating like a living heartbeat, and I was dissolving into it. I felt the boundaries of my skin melting away. I was no longer Elias Thorne. I was just a vibration, a single note in a choir that had been singing since the glaciers receded. And then the world ended. It didn't end with a whimper. It ended with a mechanical scream. The sound tore through the chanting like a chainsaw through bone. It wasn't the wind. It was a rhythmic, thundering beat that pressurized the air in the canyon. Thwack, 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 thwack. I felt the downdraft before I saw them. It hit the clearing like a physical hammer, flattening the ferns, whipping the dust into a blinding storm, and instantly extinguishing the small fires around the stone circle. The violet light, that beautiful, impossible plasma, wavered. It flickered like a candle in a gale, and then, with a sound like a vacuum seal breaking, it collapsed. The connection in my brain snapped. I was slammed back into my broken body. The pain in my leg returned with a vengeance, accompanied by a ringing in my ears that drowned out everything else. Then came the lights. 3 blinding white beams, xenon searchlights, slashed down from the darkness. They were harsh, clinical, and violent. They cut through the mystical fog, stripping away the magic and leaving only a terrified reality. Contact. Sector 4. Contact. The voice boomed from a loudspeaker, distorted and godlike, echoing off the granite walls. It wasn't asking for surrender. It was announcing an execution. The tribe didn't freeze. Evolution had wired them for survival. The females and the younger males vanished into the tree line with that liquid speed I'd seen before, blending into the shadows as if they were made of smoke. But the alpha didn't run. He stood his ground in the center of the stone circle, right where the violet light had been moments before. He looked up at the hovering black shapes, two heavy transport helicopters, sleek and unmarked, hanging in the air like giant predatory insects. He bared his teeth. I saw the saliva flying from his mouth as he roared. It wasn't the infrasound singing anymore. It was a challenge, a primal, rage-filled scream that managed to cut through the turbine noise. He wasn't just an animal defending territory. He was a king defending his temple. He reached down, grabbing a loose boulder the size of a microwave oven. With a motion that blurred in the strobe lights, he hurled it upward. Clang! The rock smashed into the landing skid of the lead helicopter. The machine lurched violently to the left, the pilot fighting for control. Sparks rained down on us. For a second, I thought he might win. I thought the myth might beat the machine. But we humans are good at one thing: destroying what we don't understand. From the side doors of the helicopters, I saw the muzzle flashes. Pff, pff, pff. They weren't using bullets. They were using high-velocity tranquilizer darts, huge canisters the size of soda cans. I saw the impacts. One hit the alpha in the shoulder, exploding in a cloud of gas. Another hit his thigh. A third struck him square in the chest. He staggered. He swiped at the darts, ripping one out with a spray of dark blood, but the chemicals were fast. Too fast. His roar turned into a confused grunt. His knees buckled. This mountain of muscle, this creature that could snap a pine tree in half, began to sway. He looked at me. In the middle of that swirling dust under the harsh glare of the searchlights, he locked eyes with me one last time. The intelligence was fighting against the fog of the drugs. His eyes were wide, filled not with hate but with a profound, crushing betrayal. He reached a hand out, not to hurt me, but towards the tree line. "Go!" his posture screamed. "Run!" But I couldn't run. My leg was useless. The paste had paralyzed my motor functions. I was just a statue, forced to witness the fall of a god. He crashed to the ground. The earth shook when he hit. Immediately, ropes dropped from the helicopters. Men in black tactical gear fast-roped down. They didn't look like park rangers. They wore full-face ballistic helmets with insect-like night vision goggles. No insignias, no patches. They swarmed him, 6 men on each limb. They were throwing heavy cargo nets over him, securing chains, jamming electric prods into his side whenever he twitched. One of the soldiers broke off from the pack and walked toward me. He moved with a robotic efficiency. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't ask if I was okay. He shined a flashlight directly into my dilated pupils, blinding me. He tapped his headset. Asset Alpha secure for extraction. Civilian witness located at the perimeter. Condition stable but non-ambulatory. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a black hood. "Wait," I croaked. My voice was a broken whisper. Don't hurt him." The soldier paused. He leaned in close, his face masked. His voice filtered through a modulator. "You didn't see anything, sir. Just a bear." He pulled the bag over my head. The world went black. The last thing I heard was the sound of heavy chains being tightened and the hydraulic whine of a winch lifting something massive into the sky. I lost time again. The darkness inside the hood lasted for hours, maybe days. I remember the sensation of vibration. First a helicopter, then the smooth hum of a pressurized jet, then the swaying of a truck. When the light finally came back, it didn't filter through pine needles. It buzzed from fluorescent tubes. I woke up in a room that didn't exist. I say that because it had no windows. The walls were padded with white acoustic foam. The floor was seamless linoleum. The air smelled aggressively clean. Bleach, ozone, and recirculated air conditioning. It was freezing. I was lying on a hospital bed, but I wasn't in a hospital. There was no nurse call button, no TV, just a steel table bolted to the floor and a mirror that spanned the entire far wall. I knew enough about interrogation rooms to know I was being watched. I looked down at my leg. It was fixed, not just splinted, surgically repaired. I could feel the tension of internal pins and the itch of healing stitches under clean gauze. Someone had operated on me while I was out. Professional work, expensive work. I lay there for what felt like 2 days. Trays of food were slid through a slot in the heavy steel door. Tasteless gray mush, lukewarm water. No one spoke to me. The silence here was different from the woods. The woods were quiet, but they were alive. This silence was dead. It was the silence of a tomb. On the third day, the lock clicked. A man walked in. He didn't look like the soldiers in the forest. He wore a charcoal gray suit that cost more than my truck. He had a face you'd forget 5 seconds after seeing it. Bland, smooth, and terrifyingly calm. He carried a single manila folder. He didn't introduce himself. He pulled out the metal chair, sat down, and opened the file. He didn't ask me how I was. He didn't ask me what I saw. He told me. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice level and monotone. "We are glad to see you're recovering. You've been through a traumatic event." I tried to sit up, my throat dry as sandpaper. "Where is he?" "The big one. The one who sang." The man didn't even blink. He tapped a paper in the file. "According to the official incident report, you suffered a severe fall in the uncontrolled sector of the Hoh rainforest. You sustained a compound fracture of the tibia and severe dehydration. As a result, you entered a state of septic shock and delirium." "I didn't imagine it," I croaked. "I was there for a week. They have a language. They have a ceremony." The man leaned forward. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Mr. Thorne, you were attacked by a rogue Kodiak bear that had migrated abnormally south. It mauled you. You hallucinated the rest due to the pain." He slid a photograph across the table. It was a picture of a dead bear, a massive one, riddled with bullets. It looked real. It looked perfect. "This is the official narrative," he continued. "Now here is your reality." He laid out 2 paths, clear as day. Option A, you persist with this story about singing monsters. We transfer you to a psychiatric facility for indefinite observation. You lose your logging pension because you're mentally unfit. You lose your reputation. And frankly, people who talk about these things tend to have accidents. Sad, lonely accidents. He paused, letting that hang in the sterile air. Option B, you sign this non-disclosure agreement. You confirm the bear attack. You accept a generous settlement for your workplace injury, enough to retire comfortably. You go home. You see your daughter. You never speak of this again. I looked at the pen he placed on the table. It was a heavy, expensive fountain pen. I thought about the alpha. I thought about the way he looked at me before he fell, that look of betrayal. If I signed, I was sealing that betrayal. I was helping them bury the truth. I was erasing an entire civilization with a drop of ink. But I was tired. I was broken. And I was scared. Not of the monster in the woods, but of the monster in the suit. I picked up the pen. My hand shook. I felt like a coward. I felt small. "It wasn't a bear," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "Sign the paper, Mr. Thorne," the man said. I signed. The moment the ink touched the page, the tension left the man's shoulders. He closed the file, stood up, and knocked on the door. "Transportation is waiting." They drove me to the edge of Port Angeles and dropped me off at a motel with a duffel bag of clothes and a check in my pocket. I watched the black sedan disappear into traffic. I stood there surrounded by the noise of cars and people, feeling more alone than I ever had in the dark of the forest. I had survived. But the Elias Thorne who went into those woods, he died in that white room.